On a still December night in Cape Girardeau, the Glen house rises like a memory refusing to fade. Some swear a lone figure walks its upper hallway at Christmas, pausing where sorrow once settled. So we ask gently, when a story clings to old walls, does it ever loosen its hold? In the quiet hours as river winds stir softly. Welcome, friends of the Ozarks. Tell me where you are watching tonight and what memories this house stirs in you. Settle close, subscribe if you wish, and join our circle. A winter hush settles over Cape Girardeau as the river draws long, silver breaths beneath the bluff. Down along South Middle Street, the Glen house rests in its dignified stillness, a Victorian silhouette against the cold sky. At first glance, it looks like any preserved treasure from the late 19th century, restored with careful hands and kept upright by the pride of townspeople who refuse to let it fade. Yet when one stands before it on a December evening, something quieter moves under the paint, deeper than each careful renovation. There is a feeling, subtle but unmistakable, that this house remembers. It remembers the footsteps that climbed its stairs, the laughter that swelled through its rooms during holiday gatherings, and the private sorrows that lived behind lace curtains. As the wind brushes the eaves and the windows dim into dusk, the Glen house seems to lean slightly forward, as though listening to the footsteps of time returning to its porch. The house was built during a period when Cape Girardeau stood at a crossroads, half river town and half ambitious city, with merchants dreaming of prosperity and families striving to make their mark. The Mississippi carried steamboats filled with news, goods, and restless travelers, churches filled on Sundays, parlors filled on holidays, and the Glen house, handsome, ornate, and finely crafted, rose as a symbol of refinement. Its architecture spoke of a certain confidence, delicate trim work, tall windows, a steep-pitched roof that gave the air of Victorian aspiration. Families strolling by would slow their steps, admiring the home built by those who believed Cape Girardeau was entering a golden age. Yet a home is never just lumber and brick. It is shaped by the people who sweep its floors and close its doors against the cold. And so, to understand the Glen house, we must return to the years when Edwin Dean Glen and his wife Lulu first stepped onto that grand porch. Edwin had come to Cape Girardeau as part of a respected lineage, bringing with him the Glen family's name and influence. Lulu carried her own quiet grace, known among neighbors for her soft presence and her devotion to the rhythms of family life. They belonged to a class that held gatherings in parlors lit by oil lamps, where the clink of glass and polite laughter marked the social heartbeat of the town. As more families settled along the river and the century turned, the Glen house took on its own place in the local imagination. There were Christmas seasons when carriages lined the street, their lamps glowing like fallen stars. Neighbors would speak of the warm light spilling from the Glen windows, the silhouettes passing by lace curtains, the greenery draped over banisters. Yet beneath that festive charm lived the simple truth that every family story contains moments not meant for the front page of a newspaper. Even in its earliest years, the Glen house saw its share of quiet strains, illness, hushed conflicts, old burdens carried silently. And while the papers of the time recorded very little, the walls of a home do not easily forget. Standing on the property today, if one listens closely, the ambience of the river town of 1895 feels strangely near. The sound of a faraway train drifting across the water, the thrum of winter wind sliding through the trees, the faint echo of carriage wheels clattering along frozen cobblestones. Visitors often speak of sensing an odd heaviness in the air on cold nights, especially near December. Perhaps it is simply the weight of history pressing close. Or perhaps it is something else, a memory still replaying itself in the stillness. Inside the house, each room seems to hold a layer of time. The parlor, arranged with Victorian care, still whispers of gatherings long vanished. The dining room, with its period decorations, feels ready for a family returning from church in their winter coats. And the upper hallway, where so many visitors claim strange sensations, stretches like a narrow bridge between decades. The floors creak beneath each step, but there is one particular sound that many describe with hesitation. A creak in the upper hallway, soft, slow, deliberate. A single board that seems to answer footsteps even when no one is there. Caretakers through the years have explained it as nothing more than settling wood, the predictable breathing of an old house. And perhaps they are right. Old houses speak in their own language. But those who have heard this particular creak, especially during the stillness of the Christmas season, often pause before accepting the easy explanation. They describe it not as a sharp settling pop or the natural groan of timber, but something more measured, an old familiar footfall, as if someone were pacing gently in the hours after midnight. It is here, in this blend of history and quiet mystery, that the Glen House begins to reveal why its story has held Cape Girardeau's imagination for generations. For some, the house stands as a testament to the ambitions of its builders and the perseverance of local preservationists. For others, it is a reminder of the fragility of family, of the way sorrow can leave its imprint long after the people themselves have passed on. And for a few, those who have walked the hallway alone at dusk, it is a place where the line between memory and haunting thins just enough to make the heart beat a little faster. Tonight, as we step deeper into the story, we move slowly, with respect for the families who lived here and for the town that carries their legacy. Nothing in this documentary will be invented or sensationalized. We will follow the historical trail where it leads, through old newspaper records, community recollections, and the preserved spaces inside the house. But we will also acknowledge the whispers, the legends, and the gentle unease that continues to accompany the Glen House during the coldest part of the year. So as we linger on this winter night, with the river murmuring below the bluff and the town settling into quiet, we listen once more to that upper hallway. The sound is faint, barely more than a breath, just the softest creak, like a board responding to a familiar step, a step that should not be there. The door at the top of the staircase remains slightly ajar, as though someone has stepped through it only moments before our arrival. In an old house, a door like this often has a mind of its own, swelling with moisture or shrinking in the dry winter air. Yet here, in the Glen House, that narrow opening seems to hold a certain intention, a quiet invitation into the years when Edwin and Lulu Glen walked these rooms with confidence and expectation. The faint glow of restored sconces along the hallway walls casts softened shadows, the kind that blur the present and leave just enough room for memory to drift in. It is through this doorway, left open by time or something quieter, that we begin to understand the people who shaped this place and the echoes they left behind. Edwin Dean Glen was not simply another resident of Cape Girardeau. He belonged to a lineage that carried weight in the river town's social world. His father, George C. Glen, had once been among the city's prominent figures, helping define civic life as Cape Girardeau, moved from frontier settlement to polished river city. Coming from that background, Edwin inherited both opportunity and expectation. He was educated, capable, and determined to leave his own imprint on the community. When he and Lulu moved into the house that would later carry their name, it was more than a mere place to reside. It was a testament to an emerging social identity, a declaration that the Glen family intended to stand among the influential households shaping the region's future. Lulu herself brought an air of refinement that neighbors remembered long after her departure. Descriptions of her suggest a woman whose presence was gentle rather than imposing, but steady in a way that centered her family. She was often noted for her taste in domestic decor and her commitment to the rituals of Victorian life. Seasonal gatherings, formal dinners, carefully arranged rooms that mirrored the era's standards of elegance. Locals spoke of the Glenn household as polished, perhaps even aspirational, and during its early years, the house reflected that pride. Curtains were pressed and tied back each morning. The home's porch railings glistened with fresh paint, and during the Christmas season, greenery draped along the banister in a way that later visitors attempted to recreate, but could never quite replicate. Though Cape Girardeau was growing, life in the 1890s still carried a certain intimacy. Neighbors knew the timbre of each other's footsteps on the boardwalk. They recognized the sound of every carriage by the rhythm of its wheels. Houses like the Glenn House became part of the town's listening landscape. One could tell which family was entertaining guests by the glow of lamps or the muffled laughter drifting through open windows on summer nights. In winter, sounds carried even farther. A piano played for guests could be heard from the next block. A conversation on a front porch traveled clean across the chill. And a single door closing upstairs, a sound described by later tenants as strangely deliberate, would not go unnoticed by anyone in the floors below. Historical records show that Edwin and Lulu were active members of their community. They attended church regularly. They hosted gatherings. They were mentioned in local papers not for scandal or spectacle, but simply as part of Cape Girardeau's respectable social fabric. Yet even the most poised households carry burdens that do not make their way into newsprint. Letters, private conversations, and family diaries, if any survived, no longer speak. But we know from census and newspaper data that illness brushed the Glenn family during their residence, and that some of the couple's plans, financial and otherwise, did not unfold as they had hoped. These quiet disappointments, these private sorrows, are the threads that often weave themselves into the folklore of a place, especially when those who once lived there have long departed and only the house remains to hold the memory. Visitors walking through the Glenn house today rarely feel the presence of Edwin. His life was marked by ambition, public engagement, and the movements of a man pushing forward in a changing era. But the house seems to respond differently to the memory of Lulu. Many describe a sense of gentleness in the air of the upper rooms, a soft watchfulness that's difficult to explain. Whether these impressions originate from preserved photographs, from her reputation in old newspaper mentions, or perhaps from the enduring pull of local stories, it is hard to say. But when one stands near that door left slightly ajar at the top of the stairs, it is Lulu people think of, not Edwin. And perhaps that small detail reveals something about the emotional imprint families leave behind. Still, facts remain facts. During the Glenn's time in the house, Christmas was a season of careful preparation. Weeks before the holiday, Lulu would arrange greenery on the mantel, candles in the windows, and ribbons on the newel post. Friends and neighbors recalled her knack for making the home feel warm and welcoming. And if one imagines that same upper hallway during those festive nights, lamps glowing, family voices rising and falling, the Glenn children moving up and down the stairs, it becomes easier to understand why later generations felt something still lingers here. The holidays have a way of intensifying emotion, whether joy or sorrow, and homes often hold those feelings like fingerprints. The Glenn house remained a place of social prominence for several years under Edwin and Lulu's care. Yet beneath the surface of the family's outward confidence, subtle shifts began to reshape their life inside the home. Economic strains hinted at in old court records, the pressures of maintaining high social expectations, and the quiet toll of illness all moved around them like undercurrents. A home so carefully arranged can become a fragile shell when the weight of private sorrow grows. And though the newspapers recorded little, the house itself seemed to keep listening, its stairway boards holding every step, its doors responding to every draft of emotion. Standing in that upper hallway now, the slightly open door seems less like a quirk of age and more like an unfinished sentence. It marks the point where history loses clarity. The Glenn family's hopes, disappointments, arguments, reconciliations, all the threads that made up their life, exist only in faint traces. Yet those traces have shaped the local stories that would later surround the house. A house does not become a legend all at once. It begins with one detail, one memory, one moment left unresolved. In the Glen house, many believe that moment began upstairs, in a quiet doorway that never fully closed. As we pause here, at the threshold between the Glen's bright beginnings and the quieter shadows that would spread across their years in this home, the house seems to breathe around us. The walls hold their place, the air settles, and from somewhere above, faint and nearly indistinguishable from the settling timber, comes a soft sound, just the hint of a creak at the landing, slow, measured, and out of step with the present moment. The slight crack in the doorway becomes our passage into the quieter rhythms of the Glen family's winters, and with it, the feeling of Christmas seasons that once wrapped themselves around these rooms like warm wool. In the faint draft drifting through that opening, one might imagine the scent of evergreen carried down from the attic, or the gentle rustle of ribbon as Lulu arranged decorations on the polished mantel. For in the years when the Glen house was filled with holiday light, its rooms glowed with a mixture of refinement, aspiration, and the familiar tenderness shared by families trying to hold tight to their cherished traditions. Standing in that upper hallway, with the door drifting open as though brushed by a passing memory, we step into a season long vanished, yet somehow still echoing through the walls. Christmas in Cape Girardeau during the late 19th and early 20th centuries carried its own character, shaped by Rivertown life and Victorian sensibilities. Newspapers described the clatter of horse-drawn wagons delivering parcels to Main Street shops, the solemn sound of church bells calling families to Advent services, and the way the Mississippi wind cut sharply through layers of wool and lace. But inside the Glen house, the season softened. Lulu Glen was known among neighbors for her ability to create a warm and welcoming home, especially during winter gatherings. She brought life to each room with sprigs of holly, strings of popcorn, and candles that flickered gently in the windows, guiding visitors toward the porch with a sense of anticipation. The dining room table would shine beneath its winter linens. The parlor would fill with the low murmur of conversation, the clinking of glassware, and the soft glow of lamplight. Children in the Glen household experience Christmas as a blend of joy and disciplined Victorian ritual. Stockings were hung with care, though early accounts suggest they were often filled with modest gifts: oranges, small toys, hair ribbons, and perhaps a bit of candy if the family finances allowed. The Glens were not extravagantly wealthy, but they upheld the tradition of a polished holiday season, and the house itself served as the canvas for those memories. In those early years, the home was a place of comfort, a gathering spot for relatives, neighbors, and church members who arrived bundled against the cold and left warmed by companionship. Yet beneath this outward cheer, small hints of strains sometimes filtered into the season. Old Cape Girardeau papers occasionally mention periods of illness affecting local families, including the Glens. Winter was hard on many households, and respiratory ailments were common. There were seasons when sickness shadowed the holiday preparations, when Lulu's hands worked more slowly, and Edwin's expression reflected worry rather than celebration. Illness in a home can cast long reflections, especially when it strikes during the time families most wish to gather and rejoice. Though the printed record remains sparse, community recollections speak of years when laughter in the Glen house sounded a bit more restrained, as if joy were tempered by something unspoken. And yet the traditions continued. Even during the heavy winters, the Glens upheld their Christmas rituals, perhaps clinging to them as a reminder of stability and hope. The greenery still hung along the staircase rail, the candles still burned in the parlor, the family still knelt in prayer on Christmas Eve. These rhythms, carried out through both plentiful and difficult years, left impressions that lingered long after the family departed. It is perhaps no coincidence that most of the whispered stories tied to the Glen house surface, during the holiday season. Memory and ritual intertwine, and a house that held so many Christmases may very well replay its emotional history during the same season each year. Local folklore claims that during some winter nights, long after the Glens had left, the faint sound of footsteps was heard near the staircase, followed by a soft swaying sound, like fabric or ribbon brushing the wall. Neighbors told of glimpsing a pale, flickering glow in the front windows when the house stood empty. Some believed they saw a figure moving from room to room, pausing near the staircase landing before fading into shadow. These stories were not shouted from rooftops. They were shared over back fences, whispered late at night during family gatherings, or mentioned by children on their walk home from school. And though such stories grew with time, their earliest seeds were planted during the Glen family's own Christmases. Part of what gives the Glen house its enduring mystique is the way its architecture seems built for memory. The tall windows allow the winter light to spill across the floors in long, thin patches. The curved banister of the staircase guides the eye upward, drawing attention to the upper hall where so many have reported inexplicable sensations. The layout of the rooms encourages movement from one space to another, yet always funnels attention back to that narrow landing. Visitors sometimes describe feeling watched, not with malice, but with a quiet, lingering attentiveness, as if someone from the past still stands just out of sight, listening to how the present speaks. During December tours in modern times, volunteers often recall moments when guests drew sudden breath while climbing the stairs. A few claim to sense a shift in the air, a faint chill trailing behind them, even while the house remained heated. On one occasion, a guide noted that children on a school trip stopped mid-step, turned toward the upper landing, and whispered that they heard someone walking. Although the children quickly returned to chatter, the guide never forgot their sudden pause, their wide eyes fixed on that shadowed stretch of hallway. These impressions do not constitute evidence, but they do weave into the broader tapestry of Glen House lore, stories tied specifically to winter, specifically to Christmas, and specifically to the emotional gravity that deepened during the Glen's later years. Though the family maintained appearances, financial difficulties began to influence their life inside the home. A few historical records point to financial strain, property liens, and the uneasy weight of debt. These issues, common among families striving to keep up appearances in Victorian society, would have generated stress that lingered even during the holiday season. Imagine Lulu, determined to uphold their traditions despite the burdens that pressed against her family. Imagine Edwin pacing the parlor late at night, calculating expenses by lamplight, trying to preserve the home's dignity. These are the images that shape the emotional context of the Glen house, a place where holiday warmth mixed with private worry. It is around this period that the earliest hints of sorrow begin to appear in local memory. A minor illness here, a quiet family hardship there, details preserved not in newspaper headlines, but in the recollections of those who lived nearby. These small hardships, though rarely recorded, form the backbone of the legends that later attach themselves to the house. People said that during one particular winter, the sound of weeping was heard from the upstairs hallway, soft, intermittent, and unmistakably human. Although there is no official record of such an event, the story persisted. Some said it was Lulu. Others claimed it was the spirit of someone whose name never appeared in public documents. Regardless of its source, the story clung to the Christmas season like frost on a window pane. In time, these whispers grew into something more structured. Stories of a solitary candle burning by itself in the parlor began circulating quietly among the townspeople. No one claimed to see it directly, but the tale appeared in enough retellings that it became part of the Glen house's winter identity. A single candle burning against the cold, flickering as though someone had just passed by. Was it merely a trick of lamplight, or a shared memory distorted gently by time? The answer remains uncertain, but the image endures. As the Glen family's Christmas traditions faded into memory and the years rolled onward, the house held tightly to its winter stories. Visitors continued reporting odd sensations during December tours, and caretakers noted strange readings on temperature meters near the upper hallway. But the strongest image, the one that persisted through generations, was always that lonely candle flame, a single point of light in the parlor, glowing where no one was present, refusing to be extinguished by time. And so we leave this part of the story with that candle, burning softly in the dark, its small flame flickering like a heartbeat, waiting to be understood. The candle flickers softly in the mind's eye, a single flame trembling in a room that no longer belongs to any living soul. It is here, in this quiet shimmer of imagined light, that a new layer of the Glen house begins to unfold. Not through the voices of the family who once lived here, for their letters and diaries are lost to time, but through the murmurs of a community that watched the house slip from domestic haven to whispered curiosity. For when a story cannot be told by the people who lived it, it is often carried instead by the neighbors who observed from just beyond the porch rail. And so, as that candle burns unsteadily in the parlor, we turn to the early recollections of Cape Girardeau. Residents who found themselves puzzled by small happenings near the Glen house during the cold winters that followed the family's departure. It is important to tread gently here. Folklore is not a ledger of facts, nor a sworn testimony. It is a vessel shaped by half-remembered moments, softened emotions, and the quiet confessions made among friends. Yet these early whispers form the earliest roots of the Glen house haunting, and to ignore them entirely would be to dismiss the cultural memory of the very people who kept the house alive in the town's imagination. The stories begin simply enough. Children walking home from evening church services who claim to see a faint glow in the parlor window long after the house stood empty. Their parents dismissed it as reflections from passing lamps or the eyes of youthful imagination. But the stories persisted. Some children insisted they saw movement behind the lace curtains, a shadow that seemed to drift past the window and pause. When pressed, they could describe little more than a shape, slender, soft at the edges, almost floating. No dramatic claims, no ghostly spectacle, only a gentle, quiet figure whose presence made them walk a little faster toward home. Adults, naturally, were more reserved in their accounts, but even among grown neighbors, a few unusual observations made their way into the conversation. A man returning from late chores recalled hearing what he thought was the muffled sound of a woman's voice, too faint to make out, almost like a sigh, coming from the direction of the house. Another neighbor reported seeing curtains sway though the night was still. These details sound almost ordinary when taken individually, but collectively they wove themselves into a subtle narrative that something in the Glen house had not settled, that some part of its emotional history clung to the winter nights. In the Ozarks, especially during the early 20th century, people did not speak lightly of such matters. Superstition and faith lived side by side, like twin rivers shaping the culture of small towns. People respected the unseen but did not invite it. They listened for the stories carried by elders but did not amplify them beyond a whisper. Yet the Glen house stories, however softly they spread, continued to return each year around Christmas time. It was almost as if the season itself, the stillness, the long nights, the way the river fog rose and clung to the bluff, created the perfect atmosphere for memory to step forward. The candle in the parlor became the centerpiece of these tales. Repeated often enough, the story gained a consistency that folklorists would later find intriguing. Always a single candle, always in the parlor, always described as glowing faintly as though attended by unseen hands. No one claimed to watch it ignite. No one said they saw it extinguish. It simply existed in the collective memory, a symbol rather than an event. When asked who might be responsible for such a visitation, neighbors usually offered the same answer in a quiet, uncertain tone. It must be a woman. There was no proof for this conclusion, no direct observation, but perhaps something about the house's emotional signature suggested a feminine presence. Houses often absorb the temperament of those who spend the most time in them, and in Victorian households, the emotional rhythm of the home was shaped more by the women who tended its daily life than by the men who moved in and out according to business. Slowly, as the years passed, the Glen house began to settle into local legend. People said that during some Decembers, especially on cold nights when the river mist crept up the bluff, the sound of footsteps could be heard in the upper hallway. Not loud, not urgent, just the steady, gentle pacing of someone walking back and forth as though lost in thought. When the house sat empty, this claim grew in weight. It is one thing to hear footsteps in a lived-in house. It is quite another to hear them in a home locked and unoccupied, the key held by a city official, the rooms undisturbed for seasons at a time. Even in the absence of dramatic details, these early accounts share a notable quality. They are soft, sorrowful, almost tender. Not one suggests violence or fear. Not one describes a figure acting with malice. Instead, the stories evoke the sense of someone who simply has not finished her connection to the place. A presence felt rather than seen. A memory replaying itself rather than a spirit seeking to alarm. And if the Glen house chose to hold such a presence, it would not be the first of its kind in Ozarks lore. Throughout the region's history, many old homes have carried similar stories. Echoes of footsteps, glimpses of figures, moments where the boundary between past and present seems to thin. Such stories, regardless of their origin, often reflect the emotional truths of a community more than literal events. But with all folklore comes the question, what is real and what is merely the product of time polishing memory into myth? Local historians, examining these accounts years later, found that many details are impossible to verify. No official records document strange happenings during the Glen family's residence. No police logs report disturbances after they left. And yet the stories existed, shared quietly enough to avoid attention, yet steadily enough to survive for generations. This paradox, where nothing is formally recorded but much is remembered, creates the fertile ground where Ozark's legend thrives. Still, among these whispers, one detail stands out in its persistence: the image of that candle burning alone in the parlor. The story appeared in multiple retellings from people who never met one another, people separated by decades. Folklorists describe such recurring images as anchor motifs, details that serve as emotional focal points within a narrative, even when the surrounding events shift over time. Why a candle? Perhaps because a candle is fragile, intimate, and symbolic of both presence and absence. Its light is enough to suggest someone is near, yet its flicker hints at impermanence. In winter, when the nights grow long and the memory of those who have passed feels closest, a candle embodies longing more than certainty. And so, as community whispers gathered and layered themselves over the empty rooms of the Glen house, the legend grew, not as a tale of fear, but as one of lingering presence. A woman's voice too soft to understand, a curtain that moves without breeze, footsteps pacing at Christmas, and always that candle. Tonight, as we sit with these early tales whispered by Cape Girardeau residents long gone, the candle flame in the parlor grows brighter in our imagination. It trembles once more, as if stirred by a passing presence. And with that movement, we are left with a final sensation, one that has unsettled visitors for more than a century. A faint sound from the corner of the room, a soft sob, nearly inaudible, carried across the winter hush. The faint sob drifts across the parlor like a shiver of cold air, barely strong enough to stir the dust motes resting in the winter light. It is not sharp, not sudden, but thin and wavering, as though someone were holding back tears rather than giving into them. In most old houses, a sound like this can be explained away by the sigh of settling timbers, the shift of temperature in the plaster, or the echo of one's own breath mistaken for something else. Yet in the Glen house, that soft sob seems to linger just long enough to make a visitor pause and turn toward the shadows. It is in that hesitation, in the quiet moment when the sound refuses to be named, that we step into the deeper, more difficult chapter of the Glen story. A chapter built not on legend, but on documented sorrow, newspaper fragments, and the invisible weight of family hardship. For all the elegance and calm the Glen house once displayed, its history was not untouched by grief. Like many Victorian families, the Glens faced trials that were rarely spoken of publicly. The culture of the time encouraged silence surrounding illness, financial struggles, and personal losses. Respectable families were expected to maintain composure, to protect their privacy, and to let only the most polished version of themselves appear in public spaces. This meant that when hardships came, and they always did, they were often borne quietly behind lace curtains and closed doors. In the case of the Glens, that silence would eventually settle into the memory of the house itself, creating the emotional foundation for the haunting stories that endured long after the family was gone. Historical records indicate that the Glen family faced a series of difficulties in the years after moving into the house. Census data and property documents reveal financial pressures that grew steadily, straining the family's once confident position in Cape Girardeau society. A few court notices suggest that debts and liens shadowed their later years, the kind of burdens that often forced families of the era to make hard decisions or accept painful compromises. Financial struggle alone does not leave a haunting, but it creates an atmosphere of anxiety, a tightening of breath that can linger in the very rhythm of a home's daily life. More quietly, illness threaded itself through the household. Newspapers of the time frequently mentioned outbreaks of respiratory disease in the region, consumption, pneumonia, influenza, ailments that swept through families without warning, especially during the winter months. Though the Glen's private medical history is largely unknown, various indirect references suggest that illness touched the family, casting shadows of worry over their winter gatherings. In Victorian homes, sickness often accompanied the long nights, the damp air from the river, and the isolating chill of December. A house that once rang with laughter during Christmas could quickly become a place of hushed footsteps, whispered prayers, and the muffled sounds of sorrow drifting from room to room. Stories preserved in local memory hint at a specific moment of loss within the family. Although no official obituary survives to confirm the details, elderly residents interviewed decades later spoke of a child who may have died young, perhaps an infant, perhaps a toddler, perhaps even a stillbirth. In that era, such tragedies were devastatingly common, yet rarely announced publicly, unless the family held significant social standing or the death occurred dramatically. More often, the passing of a child was acknowledged through simple church records, a short note in the local paper, or not at all. The family grieved privately, relying on close friends and clergy for comfort. If such a loss occurred in the Glen household, and the quiet insistence of local memory suggests it did, it would explain why some of the earliest ghost stories centered on sorrow rather than fright. A home touched by the grief of parents mourning a child carries a different kind of silence, one that settles deep into its walls. Visitors decades later who reported a feeling of sadness or a heaviness near the staircase may not have been sensing a ghost at all, but the echo of a family's emotional imprint preserved in the stillness of winter. Yet grief within a home rarely stems from a single event. The Glen struggles appeared to compound over time, layer upon layer, like frost building along a window pane. Social expectations weighed heavily on Victorian couples, especially on women like Lulu, who were tasked with maintaining the appearance of a perfect household regardless of the storms gathering outside or within. If illness struck, she bore the responsibility of nursing the sick. If finances faltered, she shouldered the emotional toll of keeping worry from the children. If grief entered the home, she absorbed its weight silently, tending the house with trembling steadiness even as her heart carried unseen fractures. In small communities, neighbors often perceive these unspoken difficulties. Over time, recollections of the Glen's later years described a diminishing brightness in Lulu's countenance. She was still gracious, still kind, but quieter. Less laughter during socials, less energy in her step. A neighbor recalled in an interview many years later that something in the Glen home felt dimmer in those last winters, though she could not pinpoint why. Memories like these, subjective, emotional, filtered through decades, do not provide historical proof, but they do paint a consistent picture of a family gradually strained by sorrow. It is here, in this context of unspoken grief, that the story of the faint sob gains meaning. Many who later worked in or visited the house described hearing what they believed to be a woman crying softly, never loudly, never clearly enough to identify, always distant, like someone weeping into her own hands. These accounts surfaced primarily during the Christmas season or in the cold early months of the new year, a time when the Glen family had once experienced both their happiest celebrations and their most painful trials. Some caretakers tried to explain the sound as the wind passing through imperfect window frames or the shifting of old wooden floors. Others believe the accounts were shaped by suggestion. Visitors already primed by local lore might interpret ordinary noises as something more ghostly. And yet, the consistency of the reports raised a quiet question. Why would different people, separated by decades, describe the same sound in the same part of the house at the same time of year? Coincidence is always possible. But the emotional memory of grief, if such a thing can indeed echo through time, might also create a subtle resonance that sensitive visitors detect without fully recognizing its origin. As the Glen's difficulties deepened, the family eventually left the house. Their departure was not marked by public spectacle or dramatic farewell. Like many families of the era, they simply moved on, leaving the home to its next chapter. But houses remember the weight of human sorrow long after the doors close. And in the Glen house, those memories may have taken the shape of a soft sob floating through winter air, a sorrowful reminder of what the family carried quietly in their hearts. In the years that followed, when new owners came and went, a particular caretaker reported something unsettling on a December night while cleaning the upstairs rooms. She heard that same faint sob, soft, trembling, unmistakably human, drifting from the far end of the hallway. When she stepped forward to investigate, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving only silence and the dim glow of her lantern flickering against the wallpaper. That single experience became the seed of a new series of stories, passed quietly among volunteers and preservationists, never meant to frighten, only to acknowledge the lingering sadness that seemed to inhabit the house's winter air. Tonight, as we draw this part of the story to a close, we return once more to that faint sob, almost inaudible, almost imagined, yet powerful enough to stop a caretaker in her tracks. And as the sound fades into the hush of the house, another detail emerges in the darkness overhead. From somewhere above, perhaps the attic, a dim light glows through the window, though no one is said to have been living there at all. The faint glow from the attic window shivers against the cold December night, pale and unsteady, like a lantern held by unsure hands. Neighbors who lived just down the hill from the Glen house spoke of that light with the kind of caution reserved for stories one is not entirely comfortable repeating. It was never bright, never bold, just a thin, wavering glimmer that appeared on certain winter nights when the river fog gathered thick around the bluff. Some swore it flickered as though a person were moving past it. Others insisted it remained still, glowing faintly before fading without cause. But the most unsettling detail was always this. The light appeared at times when the house stood empty, locked, and unattended. When a home stirs without inhabitants, the imagination begins to ask questions the heart cannot easily ignore. To understand the meaning behind that attic glow, we must step into a quieter chapter of the Glen house's story. Its years of vacancy, when the family who built it had long departed and the structure stood as a silent witness to the passing seasons. A house left empty gathers its own kind of presence. Dust settles in corners, timbers contract and expand, and the walls seem to exhale as temperatures shift. Such natural phenomena can account for many of the small sounds that later visitors described as eerie. But the glow in the attic window is harder to dismiss. Light does not appear without cause. For an old house with no electricity active in its upper rooms, the possibilities grow thin. After the Glen family left, the house passed through several hands. Some owners stayed only briefly. Others rented it out, though records are sparse and tenants seldom stayed long enough to leave detailed accounts. As Cape Girardeau modernized, the Glen house, situated on a bluff once ideal for its view, found itself overshadowed by changing priorities. New schools, new roads, new businesses drew attention away from the stately but aging Victorian structure. By the mid-20th century, the house had slipped into neglect. Peeling paint, sagging foundation elements, and shuttered windows told the story of a building left behind. Yet even in these years of disrepair, people noticed strange happenings during the cold months. Children walking home after visiting friends claimed to see the attic light from the sidewalk below. They spoke of it in hushed voices, glancing over their shoulders as though worried the house might overhear. Adults, of course, were skeptical. They explained it away as the reflection of street lamps, though none stood close enough to cast such a glow. Others claimed it was car headlights passing on the hill, though the angle of the attic window made such reflections impossible. And then there were those who simply shook their heads, unwilling to assign meaning to something that felt like an intrusion from a time long past. The attic itself, when examined decades later by restoration volunteers, offered little clarification. The room was sparse, with low rafters and old floorboards worn thin by the footsteps of families who stored trunks and Christmas decorations there long before memory frayed. Dust lay thick in the corners, undisturbed. No wiring capable of supporting a light source remained, and no lanterns or candles were found in the space. Yet the window glass bore a peculiar characteristic. In certain angles of winter moonlight, the panes reflected inward rather than outward, casting a faint internal gleam even when no light source stood behind them. A trick of optics, perhaps. But for some, that explanation felt too convenient, especially when paired with the accounts of those who insisted the glow flickered. As the years went on, the Glen house became a curiosity for local children, the kind of place they dared each other to approach on Halloween or whispered about during sleepovers. They spoke of the sobs some claimed to hear from the upper floors, of the cold patches near the staircase, and of the mysterious light that shone through the attic window at Christmas time. These stories, though fueled by imagination, were rooted in the observations of earlier generations, observations that refused to fade even as the house's physical state deteriorated. But vacancy does more than invite legends. It invites vulnerability. A house without people begins to lose its structure, its warmth, its orientation in time. Yet some buildings resist being forgotten, as though they carry a memory so strong that abandonment cannot silence it. The Glen house seemed to be one of these. Even in its darkest years, when the paint cracked and insects nested in the eaves, people felt compelled to glance at it as they passed. Something about it demanded attention, not in a threatening way, but in a sorrowful, unresolved manner. It stood not merely as an artifact of a bygone era, but as a vessel full of unspoken endings. It was during these decades of half-neglect that the first Christmas ghost stories took on shape and detail. A former neighbor, interviewed anonymously in the 1960s, recalled walking home from a holiday gathering when she thought she saw a figure in the attic window, a faint silhouette, unmoving, framed by that dim winter glow. She described it as feminine only in the vaguest sense, slender, upright and still. Her husband dismissed the sight as a trick of light, and she herself admitted the possibility. But she never forgot the feeling it invoked, a sensation that someone was watching, not with malice, but with a lingering sadness, as though longing for a world no longer hers. Another man, now passed, told his grandchildren about nights when the wind howled against the bluff and the attic light appeared as if in answer. He claimed the glow pulsed faintly, as though responding to the gusts, which frightened him only because the house had no electricity there anymore. When pressed, he added that he never saw anything move inside, never witnessed a shape, only the light. But he also confessed one detail he rarely admitted. The glow always appeared around Christmas. Such specificity is difficult to explain. Why would a light, natural or supernatural, choose a season? Why not appear in June or October? Perhaps it is coincidence, or perhaps it is tied to the emotional history of the home, the memories of holiday gatherings, the moments of joy and sorrow intertwined, the rituals that the Glenn family carried out with such care. In many Ozark stories, hauntings are strongest when tied to recurring events in the lives of those who once lived. A birthday, an anniversary, a death. Christmas, with its depth of tradition and emotional weight, would naturally become a focal point for such echoes. The attic window became a symbol of this phenomenon. People walking through the neighborhood during the mid-century years often found themselves glancing upward at the house's highest point, searching for that glow. Even those who did not believe in ghosts watched for it, compelled by the simple power of a story retold through generations. And every once in a while, someone claimed to see it, a faint shimmer in a window that should have been black as coal. By the time the Glenn house entered the era of organized restoration, the legend of the attic light had woven itself so firmly into local identity that volunteers entered the attic with hushed reverence, half expecting to feel something unusual. Some did. One volunteer reported feeling a sudden chill near the window, so sharp it made her gasp despite the warm day. Another claimed the air felt crowded near the rafters, as though someone had recently stood there. No scientific explanation surfaced for these experiences, but they added to the tapestry of impression and memory that surrounded the house. And yet, as unusual as the attic light was, it was not the only strange story whispered during the house's darkest years. Others spoke of hearing footsteps on nights when no one lived within miles of the property. Some claimed to hear furniture shifting in empty rooms. But the most persistent sound, the one repeated by multiple people across decades, was the swish of fabric brushing against the staircase, a soft movement like skirts sweeping past. Tonight, as the attic glow fades from our sight, we follow that sound downward, toward the staircase where so many swore they heard someone descend with careful, measured steps, long after the Glenn family had vanished from the rooms they once called home. The soft sweep of fabric brushing the staircase seems to hang in the air long after the sound itself fades, like a memory that refuses to let go. For those who volunteered during the restoration of the Glenn house in the 1970s, this gentle rustling was among the most commonly whispered accounts. Never dramatic, never loud, just the subtle suggestion of someone descending the stairs with a skirt, brushing lightly against the polished wood. When asked to describe it, the volunteers always used the same tone, hesitant, reflective, almost embarrassed to speak of something they could not fully explain. Yet their words aligned so consistently that the story gained quiet credibility, not through sensational claims, but through the soft hum of shared experience. And from this delicate thread, we step into the period when the Glenn house was pulled back from the brink of collapse and given a chance to breathe again. The decision to restore the Glenn house came at a moment when many such Victorian structures across the Midwest were being lost to time. In Cape Girardeau, however, a dedicated group of preservationists recognized the value of rescuing the home, not just as architecture, but as a vessel of local heritage. The house, with its ornate woodwork and signature gables, represented a chapter of Rivertown history that might otherwise vanish. Volunteers arrived with tools, brushes, and a reverence for the past that guided every step. They removed rotted flooring, reinforced beams weakened by decades of neglect, and peeled away layers of faded wallpaper to reveal the delicate patterns beneath. During this process, the house slowly awakened as though stretching after a long sleep. Yet even as they worked, the volunteers spoke quietly of strange moments that occurred mostly during December, when the holiday decorating tradition began. The Glen house, once again dressed in garlands and ribbon, seemed to take on a life of its own. Footsteps were heard in the upstairs hallway when no one was assigned to that floor. Tools left neatly arranged at the end of the day were sometimes shifted by morning. In the staircase area where the rustle of fabric had been heard, volunteers often reported feeling a sudden cold draft, brief enough to attribute to old windows, yet strong enough to linger in their memory. One volunteer, working on the second floor landing late one afternoon, swore she heard someone walk behind her, slow and measured. She turned, expecting to see another worker, but the hallway lay empty. She dismissed it as her imagination, worn thin by long hours. But when she mentioned it quietly to another volunteer, he nodded slowly and admitted he, too, had heard footsteps the week before. Light, almost dainty steps, spaced as though belonging to someone in no rush, someone making their way thoughtfully from room to room. Still, the volunteers worked on, committed to restoring the Glen house to its former dignity. They brought in antique furnishings, sewed curtains in period style, and polished the wooden banister until it gleamed. When the Christmas season arrived, they decorated the home meticulously, using greenery, candles, and ornaments reminiscent of the Glen's era. The goal was not merely to present a festive display, but to echo the spirit of late 19th century Cape Girardeau. Visitors from the community were invited in for holiday tours, fascinated by the transformation of a once-forgotten house into a living reflection of its past. It was during one of these tours that the fallen ornament incident occurred, an event small in scale, yet powerful in its influence on the house's modern folklore. A group of visitors had gathered in the parlor, listening to a guide recount the early years of the Glen family's residence. The Christmas tree, tall and carefully decorated, stood near the window. The room was warm with lamplight and the soft murmur of conversation. Then, without warning, an ornament slipped from a branch and fell onto the wooden floor, rolling to a stop near the baseboard. This might have been a simple matter of an unstable hook or a heavy ornament, yet those present claimed the tree was perfectly still, with no breeze to disturb it. Some insisted the ornament did not simply fall, but appeared to be nudged, as if brushed by a hand. One woman stepped forward to replace it and paused, feeling an unexpected chill near the tree, a cold patch so concentrated it made her catch her breath. The guide, composed and experienced, smiled and offered the rational explanation one would expect. Older ornaments sometimes shift on delicate branches, but later, out of earshot of visitors, she admitted to a colleague that the moment felt strangely intentional. It was not the first time such incidents had taken place. During the restoration, volunteers occasionally found ornaments lying on the floor after locking the house for the night, though the tree had been firmly secured. In one instance, a delicate glass bauble was discovered in the upstairs hallway, far from where it had been hung. No explanation surfaced. No intruder was suspected. The house was locked, the windows secured. These small occurrences, while not dramatic, created a subtle pattern, one that matched the gentle, sorrowful nature of the house's earlier stories. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, volunteers continued to notice these soft peculiarities, collecting them quietly like threads of a tapestry they did not quite know how to interpret. A curtain that moved slightly despite a still day, a sudden scent of old-fashioned perfume near the master bedroom, a moment when the air seemed thick, as though someone had just passed through. None of these events were frightening. In fact, many described them as elegant, almost refined, aligning with the idea that if a presence lingered in the Glen house, it was gentle, composed, and deeply tied to the rhythms of domestic life. As more volunteers joined the preservation effort, the stories continued to circulate, shared with discretion. Some believed that the house simply held echoes of the past, strong emotional memories replaying themselves during the season most closely tied to the Glenn family's joys and sorrows. Others believed that at least one spirit lingered, perhaps watching over the home as it was carefully restored, ensuring that its beauty and dignity were preserved. For those who sensed a presence, it was rarely described in ominous terms. Instead, they spoke of a feeling: gentle, quiet, watchful. This sense of watchfulness grew stronger near the staircase, the same location where the rustle of skirts was often reported. The idea that someone from the past lingered on those steps resonated deeply with the volunteers. They believed, consciously or not, that the house's emotional heart rested there, at the point where the Glenn family had once moved up and down each day, carrying their joys, burdens, and quiet griefs. And as the restoration neared completion, the house seemed to grow increasingly attentive, as if recognizing the care being given to its aging bones. By the early 1980s, the Glenn house had regained much of its former beauty. The tours grew more frequent, and visitors consistently expressed amazement at its transformation. Yet along with admiration came a renewed whispering of stories. Stories of lights flickering, footsteps heard in empty rooms, cold drafts near the staircase, and ornaments that fell without explanation. These accounts, while impossible to verify scientifically, carried a quiet weight. They reflected the belief that the Glenn house, restored to its former grace, had awakened memories long dormant. Tonight, as we linger at the foot of the staircase, the faint rustle of fabric seems again to whisper down the steps. Whether it comes from the shifting air, the settling wood, or some softer presence, we cannot be certain. But as the sound fades, another sensation rises, a subtle perfume, delicate and old-fashioned, drifting from the master bedroom like a memory carried on a winter breeze. The delicate perfume lingers in the air like a question that has not yet found the courage to speak. It curls softly through the dim hallway, faint but distinct, carrying with it the unmistakable suggestion of a woman's presence, refined, composed, familiar with the ritual of preparing a house for company. Volunteers who encountered the scent often paused without meaning to, their steps slowing as though they had stepped into someone else's memory. It was not the smell of modern fragrance or cleaning products, but something older, floral with a powdery edge, reminiscent of the Victorian toilettes once displayed across vanities in elegant homes. And it was this lingering trace of perfume that guided many deeper into the modern accounts of the Glenn house, where preservation work intertwined unexpectedly with the unexplainable, and where researchers and visitors alike found themselves confronted with moments that refused to fit neatly into either history or imagination. By the 1980s and 90s, the Glenn house stood fully restored, its rooms curated with care by the Historical Association that had dedicated years to bringing it back to life. Daily tours became a staple of the town's cultural calendar, and Christmas events grew especially popular. Volunteers dressed in period attire guided visitors through rooms adorned with greenery, candlelight, and ornaments reminiscent of the Victorian era. Holiday music played softly from hidden speakers, and the house seemed to exhale with the warmth of community attention. Yet with increased visitors came an increase in strange reports, accounts that mirrored the earlier stories but now carried the weight of multiple independent witnesses. During December tours, guests often lingered near the master bedroom doorway, remarking quietly that they smelled perfume, although no volunteers wore any. Some described it as rosewater. Others insisted it was violet or lavender. Still others believed it resembled the old-fashioned sachets their grandmothers kept tucked inside linen drawers. The consistency of these descriptions raised questions among the preservation staff. Could the source be a lingering scent absorbed by old wallpaper? Could it be a fragrance embedded in antique fabric? Theories circulated, but none held steady, especially when visitors reported the scent even during years when the house underwent ventilation improvements or when certain textiles were temporarily removed from display. Then came the stories from modern paranormal investigation groups drawn to the Glen house precisely because of its long-standing Christmas-haunting legends. These teams, some professional, some enthusiastic amateurs, entered the house with equipment designed to measure temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic fields, audio anomalies, and motion. Their findings were often inconclusive, as most such investigations tend to be. Yet a few experiences stood out in compelling ways. Multiple groups reported temperature drops near the staircase landing, especially in the evening hours or during December nights. One team recorded a dramatic 20-degree drop within seconds, localized to a small patch of air near the newel post. They could not reproduce the event later in controlled conditions, leading them to admit that while the cause remained unknown, the moment had been real. Another group collected audio during a December walkthrough. Within the faint humming of the house, pipes settling, distant traffic, the usual ambient noise, researchers noted a soft sound they could not identify. When enhanced and isolated, the audio revealed something that resembled either a sigh or the swish of fabric. It was not clear, not definitive, but it aligned uncannily with the reports of volunteers who had heard similar sounds years earlier. Still, the responsible investigators included a disclaimer. Ambient interference could not be ruled out, and the sound might have been caused by natural acoustics within the structure. Paranormal research seldom yields concrete answers, and the Glen house was no exception. Visitors during holiday tours occasionally provided their own accounts, often without knowing the house's reputation beforehand. One woman described feeling as though someone stood behind her while she examined a piece of Victorian lace in the master bedroom. When she turned, no one was there, and her husband was in another room. Another visitor felt her fingers tingle with cold upon touching the banister, though the rest of the house felt warm. A group of college students from Southeast Missouri State University claimed that during their tour, they noticed a faint reflection in the mirror above the parlor mantel, a shape they described as vaguely feminine. Their guide later assured them that reflections often distort in old glass, but the students remained convinced they had seen something not entirely their own. Skeptics remained ever present, of course, and rightly so. The Glen house, like many historic sites, sits at the intersection of fact and interpretation. Old homes creak, drafts sneak through unseen cracks. Shadows lengthen strangely in the dim lighting preferred during holiday events. And the human mind, already shaped by expectation or suggestion, can easily transform ordinary sensations into extraordinary ones. Volunteers and staff members understood this dynamic well, and they maintained a balanced approach, acknowledging reports without endorsing supernatural conclusions outright. Their goal was always historical accuracy and preservation, not sensationalism, yet even the skeptics had difficulty dismissing every account outright. One preservation board member, known for his practical disposition, admitted privately that he experienced something strange while locking up the house one December night. After turning off the parlor lamps, he walked toward the front door and heard clear, rhythmic footsteps on the upper floor. He froze, listening. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, measured. He called out, assuming a volunteer had remained upstairs by mistake. The footsteps stopped. He checked the entire second floor and attic. No one was there. Later, he told a colleague that he could find no logical explanation for the experience and hoped it would not repeat. It never did. In time, these modern reports, sudden cold patches, unexplained perfume, fleeting sounds, and soft impressions, entered the growing body of Glen house lore. And while each account could be dismissed individually, together they formed a quiet pattern, not a dramatic haunting, not a restless spirit wreaking havoc, but a gentle, watchful presence tied deeply to the rhythms of domestic life, especially during the Christmas season. A presence that moved softly, as if out of respect for the living. a presence that drifted near rooms once filled with the laughter, tears, and hopes of the Glenn family. As the Glenn house became more prominent in local tourism, reporters occasionally interviewed volunteers about their experiences. Some spoke frankly, others hesitated, concerned that sharing would diminish the house's dignity. But an interesting shift occurred in public perception. The Glenn house was no longer simply viewed as a historic landmark. It became understood as a place where the past might still breathe, gently and respectfully, through small, unexplainable moments that carried the emotional echo of its former residents. And always, these moments gathered most strongly around the staircase, the parlor, and the master bedroom, places tied to the heartbeat of the home. From these points, a particular narrative emerged, one that focused on a feminine presence, gentle but sorrowful, lingering in winter. Tonight, as the faint perfume fades into the still air of the hallway, another sound rises in its place. Not a footstep, not a sigh, but the soft, unmistakable rustle of silk brushing against a doorway. The movement is subtle, barely perceptible, yet evocative enough to draw our attention toward the shadows at the edge of the room. From within that shadow, a quiet question unfurls like a curling ribbon on the parlor floor. Why does the Glenn house seem to stir most strongly during Christmas? The question settles into the quiet like dust drifting through a shaft of winter light. Why Christmas? Why would the Glenn house, among all its seasons, awaken most vividly during the darkest months of the year? The soft rustle of silk fades at the edge of the master bedroom doorway, leaving only stillness in its place. And into that stillness enter the voices of those who came searching for answers in the modern era. Historians, volunteers, skeptics, and paranormal researchers who walked the rooms of the Glenn house with notebooks, equipment, or simply open curiosity. Each carried a different lens, a different expectation, and a different threshold for what they believed was possible. Yet collectively, their attempts to document the odd occurrences within the house created a mosaic of testimony that deserves careful attention. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Glenn house had become more than a preserved Victorian home. It had become a space of inquiry, a place where subtle phenomena drew quiet fascination rather than fear. Paranormal investigation groups, some local, some from neighboring states, requested permission to explore the home during off hours, especially in winter. These groups approached their work with varying degrees of professionalism, but many adhered to a standard method. Baseline readings, controlled movement through rooms, recorded audio sessions, and repeated checks of environmental conditions. Their goal was not to force a narrative, but to determine whether anything in the Glenn house behaved in ways that deviated from expected physical patterns. The fallen Christmas ornament was often the first example researchers mentioned, though many dismissed it as anecdotal. More compelling were temperature anomalies recorded with precision instruments. On multiple December nights, small zones of cold air, distinctly colder than the surrounding environment, formed near the staircase and in the master bedroom. These drops were often brief, lasting only seconds, but they were measurable. A researcher from a St. Louis team described one such moment in his notes. Air temperature in the hallway dropped from 72 degrees to 58 in less than 5 seconds. No draft detected, no ventilation source nearby. Returned to normal within 10 seconds. The report included timestamps and repeated attempts to recreate the event. All attempts failed. Audio anomalies also found their way into investigation logs. Some recordings captured faint sounds that resembled movement, soft tapping, distant footsteps, or a quiet rustling similar to fabric shifting. One team recorded a barely audible sigh during an otherwise silent session in the parlor. When analyzed, the sound possessed characteristics inconsistent with mechanical noise or house settling. Though the team avoided sensational claims, they concluded that the audio did not match any known structural or environmental source identified during investigation. Motion sensors occasionally activated during nighttime investigations when no human presence was near them. though skeptics argued that environmental factors or equipment sensitivity could produce false positives. Yet investigators returned to one detail repeatedly. The Glen house seemed to react most strongly during December visits. The closer to Christmas, the more frequently unusual readings occurred. Some groups tested this observation by returning in midsummer or early autumn. In those months, the house felt still, inert, content to rest in its quiet dignity. But in December, especially on cold nights when distant church bells drifted across the river, the atmosphere changed. A subtle tension rose in the air, not ominous, yet undeniably present. Visitors who came not as investigators, but as ordinary tourists also contributed to these accounts. Many entered without any knowledge of the house's reputation, drawn only by curiosity or appreciation for history. Their experiences were often the most compelling, precisely because they lacked expectation. A woman from Illinois walking through the house during a Christmas tour stopped abruptly near the parlor mantel and asked her husband whether someone had just brushed past her sleeve. He had been standing several feet away. A retired teacher from Cape Girardeau reported feeling a sudden warmth around her while standing near the Christmas tree, oddly out of place in a room known for fluctuating temperatures. A child on a school field trip told his mother he saw a lady in old-time clothes on the staircase. When asked for details, he described her as sad-looking but nice. His mother dismissed it as imagination, but she later admitted privately that the description unsettled her. Such independent, unprompted reports echoed the earlier stories whispered by neighbors throughout the mid-20th century. Long before paranormal investigations became popular, even skeptics found themselves pausing when faced with the consistency of these impressions. Were they all coincidences? Perhaps. Or perhaps the Glen house simply possessed a strong emotional signature that influenced how people experienced it, especially when the darkness of winter amplified its atmosphere. Historians approach the matter differently. Rather than focusing on unexplained phenomena, they examine the emotional and cultural landscape of the Glen family's final years in the home. They noted that the heaviest periods of illness and financial strain coincided with winter months. One historian uncovered an old court record involving a financial dispute that reached its peak in December, a small but telling detail that hinted at household stress during the holiday season. Another researcher suggested that if a child truly had died in the home, the death may have occurred in winter, given the prevalence of seasonal illness in that era. These possibilities, quiet illness, financial distress, unspoken grief, deepened the emotional resonance of the Glen house's Christmas stories. Even for those who did not believe in hauntings, the idea that winter held the family's most painful memories seemed both logical and poignant. Memory, especially sorrowful memory, often attaches itself to recurring seasons. A holiday once filled with joy can become a marker of loss. A room once filled with laughter can become a chamber of absence. The Glen house, with its polished floors and narrow hallways, may simply have absorbed the emotional temperature of those winters long ago. In modern times, volunteers often remark that the house felt different during December decorating sessions. They described entering certain rooms and sensing a presence, not frightening but watchful, as though someone from the past were observing the care given to the house. This sensation was strongest near the staircase and the parlor, where early family gatherings once centered. It was not unusual for volunteers to speak softly in these rooms, even when alone, as though respecting an unseen listener. Some attributed this to atmosphere, others to suggestion, but all agreed that the Glen house possessed a depth of feeling uncommon in restored homes. As paranormal investigations continued into the 21st century, the consensus among researchers remained cautious but consistent. The Glen house exhibited patterns that defied easy explanation. None claimed proof of spirits. None sensationalized their reports. But many admitted that the house felt active during December, quietly, gently, meaningfully active. And among these investigators, one particular moment resurfaced in nearly every discussion: The sudden appearance of a perfume scent in the master bedroom during a controlled session, detected simultaneously by 3 individuals standing several feet apart. No source was found. No fabric carried the scent. The moment lasted less than 30 seconds but left a lasting impression. It matched the accounts of volunteers, visitors, and tour groups who had smelled the same fragrance decades earlier. That perfume, that soft trace of something feminine and sorrowful, became the most defining detail of modern Glen House experiences. And whenever it appeared, investigators recorded the same reaction: silence, followed by a slow, almost reverent turning of heads toward the doorway. Tonight, as we linger at the threshold of these modern accounts, the perfume fades once more, leaving behind a question more circular than conclusive. And into that quiet circle steps the silhouette first whispered about by neighbors long ago. The image of a woman moving softly through the house, lingering near moments tied to sorrow and memory. The question rises again, but now it carries the weight of decades. Who was she? The question, who was she, lingers like a soft echo down the narrow hallway, drifting toward the parlor where sunlight slips across the old floorboards in thin, trembling lines. To many who walk the Glen House today, the identity of the gentle presence felt in its winter rooms seems almost predetermined. They speak her name quietly, as though afraid to disturb the fragile threads of memory that still cling to the house. Lulu Glen. A woman remembered for her refinement, her softness of manner, her commitment to the rituals of Victorian household life. But to understand why her name rises so naturally in conversations about the Glen House haunting, we must step away from legend and into verifiable history, to the records, the family lineage, the social expectations of her era, and the small but telling fragments left in old newspapers and local recollection. Lulu Rebecca Glen, born Lulu Houts, entered Cape Girardeau society through a marriage that blended 2 respected family lines. The Houts family name carried its own quiet weight in the region, recognized for reputable business dealings and long-standing ties to the community. When Lulu married Edwin Dean Glen, she stepped into a household that bore both opportunity and expectation. Victorian women were often measured by their grace as hostesses, their ability to maintain order and propriety within the home, and their subtle but crucial role in reinforcing the family's social standing. Lulu excelled in each of these areas. She was known for her ability to create warmth within her home, for her consistency in keeping a tidy and inviting environment, and for her loyalty to family traditions, particularly during the holidays. Old society pages capture glimpses of her, mentions of teas she attended, social gatherings where she was noted for her pleasant demeanor, events where her presence contributed to the tone of refinement the Glen family sought to project. While these small newspaper references offer only fragments, they illuminate her character in ways that resonate strongly with the emotional texture of the Glen House's lingering stories. She was a woman who gave much of herself to the domestic rhythm of the household, shaping its atmosphere year after year. For many families of that era, especially women whose roles were confined primarily to the home, emotional energy often intertwined with daily rituals: cooking, decorating, tending rooms, preparing for guests, caring for children and elders. When such energy is poured into a home with consistency and affection, it can leave an imprint that lingers even long after the family has moved on. But Lulu's life was not defined solely by domestic grace. Beneath the polished veneer of Victorian social life, she carried burdens that rarely found public expression. The cultural norms of her time discouraged open discussion of emotional hardship, illness, or grief. Yet historical clues reveal that such difficulties were indeed part of her life. Sickness moved through the Glen family in multiple seasons. Financial strain cast heavy shadows over their later years, and the deeply private sorrow hinted at by community memory, a lost child or perhaps another kind of heartbreak, would have fallen most heavily upon Lulu, who bore the emotional center of the household. To understand her presence in the Glen house's lore, one must consider not just who she was in life, but the emotional residue she may have left behind. Victorian women often kept their pain hidden, managing it quietly behind closed doors. Their tears were shed privately, their fears spoken only to God or silently endured. When neighbors recalled hearing soft sobs drifting from the upper hallway during winter nights, long after the Glens had moved away, many instinctively associated the sound with a woman's grief. They did not imagine Edwin. They did not imagine a stranger. They imagined Lulu, not because they believed she was doomed to haunt the house, but because her quiet resilience had woven her presence so deeply into the home that memory could not easily let go. The modern scent of perfume described by volunteers and visitors aligned strikingly with historical context. Victorian women commonly used floral perfumes, rosewater, violet, lilac, and lavender, scents that lingered subtly on handkerchiefs, bonnets, and high-collared dresses. If a presence remains, or if emotional memory truly can echo through a space, such a fragrance would be the most natural to manifest. Not sharp, not overpowering, just a faint, powdery sweetness drifting through the air like a gesture of gentleness. That consistency encourages some historians to suggest that the association with Lulu is not simply the product of storytelling, but of subtle sensory cues that continue to appear in the house. Photographs of Lulu from the period, few though they are, reveal a woman of soft features and composed expression, wearing the high-necked bodices and layered skirts typical of her time. In every image, she stands with a quiet dignity, her posture firm yet delicate, her hands clasped in front of her as though holding something unseen. If a visitor were to imagine a woman descending the Glen house staircase, skirts brushing the banister, it would not be surprising that the image corresponds with Lulu's era, her clothing, and her temperament, as described by those who knew her. Still, the association between Lulu and the house's reported phenomena remains speculative. History can provide context, but it cannot confirm what lingers in the air. Skeptics argue that the Glen house's winter sensations, perfume, footsteps, cold patches, are manifestations of atmospheric conditions common to old homes, especially during months of rapid temperature changes. They note that Victorian-style furnishings, layered with fabric and aged materials, can sometimes emit scents reminiscent of old perfumes. They point out that the house's aging structure naturally produces creaks and drafts. These explanations cannot be dismissed lightly. They hold credibility and align with many other historic homes across the Midwest that carry similar reputations. And yet, those who have felt the perfume drift by, who have heard the soft rustle of fabric when no one else was present, or who have sensed the gentle weight of someone unseen near the staircase, these individuals speak with a sincerity that resists easy dismissal. For them, the connection to Lulu is less about proving a haunting and more about honoring the emotional memory of a woman whose life was shaped by love, sorrow, duty, and the quiet fortitude required of her time. If the Glen house indeed holds a feminine presence, then perhaps it is not a ghost at all, but the imprint of the life Lulu poured into this home. Her holidays filled with preparation, her long winters of worry, her whispered prayers, her perseverance through illness, and her devotion to creating beauty even when hardship pressed close. It is this complexity, this blend of history, emotion, and lingering sensation that shapes the image of Lulu as the possible Christmas ghost of the Glen house. Not a specter wandering aimlessly, but a memory rooted so deeply in the home that the season of her greatest joys and sorrows awakens something gentle and watchful. And as we consider this, the soft rustle of silk fades once more into the quiet. The question of who she was begins to dissolve, giving way to a deeper inquiry, one that has hovered over the Glen house for decades. How do we distinguish between truth and legend in a place where memory and mystery intertwine so tenderly? The answer lies just beyond the doorway, where the perfume has now faded and the house waits in silence for us to step forward. The silence beyond the doorway deepens, stretching across the dim corridor like a veil. It is in that quiet where the perfume has faded and the traces of imagined footsteps soften into nothing that the Glen house invites the most difficult part of its story, the search for truth in a place shaped equally by memory and myth. Every old house carries a mixture of what can be proven and what can only be felt. In the Ozarks, where folklore and fact live side by side like neighboring farms, it is often the tension between what we know and what we sense that keeps a story alive. And so, we step now into the layer of the Glen house narrative, where evidence must sit beside intuition, where recorded history must share its seat with the inexplicable, and where we begin to ask what truly lingers in this elegant Victorian home during the coldest part of the year. To begin sorting truth from legend, we must acknowledge that much of what people report inside the Glen house falls into the realm of personal experience. Sensations, sounds, fleeting impressions, none of which can be fully proven or disproven. These accounts are emotional, subjective, and deeply human, yet they persist with a consistency that demands attention. Visitors describe the same areas of activity: the staircase, the parlor doorway, the master bedroom. They describe similar phenomena: footsteps, perfume, cold patches, the soft rustle of skirts. These patterns do not mean the supernatural is present, but they do challenge us to consider why the house seems to evoke the same impressions across decades. Architectural experts offer one set of explanations. Old homes, especially those built in the Victorian era, are prone to drafts that concentrate along stairwells and doorframes. Temperature gradients can create sudden drops or airflow patterns that feel like movement. Floors built over aging joists can creak in ways that mimic footsteps. And the decorative materials of the period, silk, wool, varnish, wallpaper paste, can release faint scents as they age or interact with humidity. According to this view, the Glen house is not haunted. It is simply alive in the way old houses often are, speaking through wood and plaster as the seasons shift. Historians add another perspective, pointing out that the Glen family lived through times of both celebration and hardship. Christmas in Victorian America was not merely a holiday, but a cultural performance, a chance to display one's stability, refinement, and familial devotion. Yet for families facing illness or financial strain, that performance came with emotional weight. Historians suggest that the residual mood of those years, joy mixed with sorrow, beauty shadowed by strain, might have shaped how later generations felt while standing in the same rooms. A place imbued with decades of emotional complexity may simply stir a deeper awareness in those who visit, especially during a season shaped by ritual and reflection. Folklorists offer a third explanation, one that speaks to the broader tradition of Ozarks storytelling. In this region, ghost stories are rarely about terror. They are about memory, unfinished, unresolved, or simply too strong to fade. The Ozarks are filled with tales of gentle hauntings: a widow watching over her old porch, a miner lingering near a collapsed shaft, a child's laughter echoing through an abandoned schoolhouse. These stories do not claim confrontation, they claim continuity. According to folklorists, the Glen house haunting fits seamlessly into this cultural pattern: a soft presence, a lingering sadness, a connection to winter, a season already rich with superstition. The idea of a woman returning at Christmas feels more like a cultural expression of longing than a supernatural assertion. And yet there remains a fourth perspective, voiced by visitors who experienced moments they cannot logically reconcile. These individuals are not eager believers or thrill seekers. Many are older, grounded, and not inclined toward dramatic interpretation. But they describe moments that leave them shaken. Footsteps in an empty hallway, a sudden scent of perfume that disappears just as quickly, a movement reflected in a mirror when no one else was present. One visitor, A retired engineer known for his skepticism admitted after a holiday tour that he felt a hand rest lightly on his shoulder as he admired a display of Victorian ornaments. He turned to find no one behind him. He left the house unsettled, not frightened, just unexpectedly moved. The Glen House rests at the meeting point of all these perspectives: architecture, history, folklore, and personal experience. To understand its mysterious reputation, we must allow each view its place. No single interpretation can explain everything. The rational cannot entirely swallow the emotional. The emotional cannot override the factual. What we are left with is a story that breathes through the cracks of certainty, a story shaped as much by the people who walk through the house today as by the family who walked through it more than a century ago. And this is where the question becomes most interesting. Why do so many people, across so many decades, describe the presence in the Glen House as feminine, gentle, and sorrowful? Why footsteps instead of dragging sounds? Why perfume instead of smoke? Why the rustle of skirts instead of slamming doors? The character of the haunting, if haunting it is, seems rooted not in fear, but in a quiet yearning. A woman lingering in the house she once tended. A mother returning to a place tied to joy and loss. A presence not seeking attention, but simply repeating the rhythms she knew best. Skeptics insist this pattern is nothing more than projection. Humans instinctively craft identities where none exist. In an elegant Victorian home with delicate furniture and floral wallpaper, the mind naturally imagines a woman. Add Christmas decorations, soft lighting, and old stories of family gatherings, and the picture sharpens. According to this explanation, the idea of a sorrowful woman at Christmas is a narrative created by the house's emotional atmosphere, not by any actual presence. But even skeptics pause when confronted with the persistence of certain details. Details that appear in accounts separated by 50, 60, even 70 years. A specific perfume, a particular footstep rhythm, a repeated sensation of someone descending the stairs. These consistencies stretch beyond the expected variations of imagination. They suggest either a remarkably stable cultural narrative or something more elusive, something tied not to fantasy but to memory. And memory is powerful. Memory shapes buildings as surely as time shapes stone. A home that once held deep emotion can continue to echo with its traces long after the source has passed. Emotional energy, joy, sorrow, devotion can imprint itself in ways that are felt intuitively rather than seen. In this sense, the Glen House may not be haunted by a ghost, but by memory itself. And for many who stand on its staircase in December, that memory feels profoundly alive. Tonight, as the question of truth versus legend drifts into the stillness of the parlor, the house offers no answers. Only the soft settling of old wood and the faint, lingering image of silk drifting across a doorway. And in that image, a final question rises, quiet but insistent. If the Glen House remembers so much, what exactly is it remembering during those cold winter nights? We step toward that question, and the hallway behind us seems to breathe, as though preparing to guide us deeper into its lingering winter. The house seems to breathe as we step deeper into its winter memory, the stillness expanding around us like the hush before snowfall. The question, what exactly is the Glen House remembering during those cold winter nights, draws us toward a broader lens, one that stretches beyond this single home and into the long tradition of winter hauntings in the Ozarks. For this region has always understood the strange intimacy between cold seasons and the stories that rise up in their depths. The Ozark mind, shaped by mountains, river fog, and long nights of solitude, has long viewed winter not as an ending, but as a thinning. A moment when the boundary between the living and the remembered grows fine as lace. To understand the Christmas haunting of the Glen House, we must step into that cultural landscape. we must consider how winter shapes the imagination, how memory deepens in the cold, how sorrow echoes more sharply against the quiet of December. And so, we begin with the simple truth that winter in the Ozarks has always carried a weight of introspection. When the leaves fall and the hills lose their green, the land becomes a place of silhouettes and stillness. Sound travels differently. The wind picks up voices and scatters them across valleys. The river grows slow beneath its own breath. It is in this bare and vulnerable season that the past feels closest, as though the cold draws it forward. Decades before paranormal investigations were fashionable, Ozark families told their ghost stories during winter, not to frighten, but to acknowledge the presence of memory. Folklorists who traveled through the region in the early 20th century collected tales of gentle apparitions who returned during the cold months. Widows visiting the hearth they once tended, children seen near the windows of cabins where they grew ill, men appearing along paths they once walked to feed their livestock on icy mornings. These stories were told with a kind of respect, not as entertainment, but as extensions of family history, as reminders that life and memory did not always part ways cleanly. In many communities, people believed that winter was the season when the heart softened enough to feel what was usually ignored. The land went quiet, the world slowed, and in that quiet, the stories of the dead, especially those tied to home, family, and seasonal rituals, returned with a clarity not felt at other times of year. Christmas, with its emphasis on gathering, memory, and the weight of absent loved ones, became the emotional core of this tradition. It is no surprise that many Ozark hauntings are associated with Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve, or the deep nights that fall between them. The Glen House, perched on its bluff above the river, carries this tradition like a second skin. Winter brings out the reflective nature of its architecture, the gables casting long shadows, the windows gleaming faintly, the staircases creaking in the quiet. Even without legend, the house itself feels built for winter reflection. Its high ceilings create slow-moving drafts, its wooden bones shift with the cold, and its narrow hallways amplify the sense of being enclosed within memory. When the Christmas decorations are brought out, the effect grows stronger. Candles flicker. The scent of evergreen lingers. The soft glow of lamplight pools around corners. In such an atmosphere, the imagination does not need much encouragement to stir. Yet the Glen House legends do not arise solely from imagination. They persist because of emotional resonance. Christmas is a season heavy with expectation, a time when families measure their joys and losses with heightened awareness. For those burdened by grief, the season can magnify sorrow. For those blessed with warmth, it deepens gratitude. Lulu Glen, according to the historical fragments we have, experienced both. Her Christmas seasons were touched by festivity and by quiet hardship. If any emotional season would imprint itself upon the house she tended, it would be winter. Psychologists suggest that places associated with repeated emotional intensity can trigger sensations of presence even centuries later. Not because spirits linger, but because the human mind recognizes subtle cues that evoke echoes of past experience. A room associated with grief may feel heavy. A hallway tied to routine pacing may evoke phantom footsteps. A parlor filled with holiday gatherings may seem to flicker with remembered light. The Glen House, layered with decades of December rituals, falls neatly into this framework. Yet this explanation does not erase the consistency of the reported phenomena. Cold patches localized to specific stair treads, the repeated appearance of a floral perfume. Footsteps heard by visitors who knew nothing of the house's reputation, the soft sob reported by both early neighbors and modern caretakers. These are not random impressions, they are patterned, and patterned impressions give even the most measured skeptic pause. The Ozarks, with its deep respect for ancestral presence, provides a cultural lens through which these patterns are interpreted. Here, a house is not simply a building, it is a vessel for the lives lived within it. When someone dies, neighbors often speak of their presence hanging around a while, not because they envision ghosts in the Hollywood sense, but because they believe the heart leaves traces. The boundary between memory and existence is not rigid. People speak of feeling their grandmother's spirit during Christmas cooking, or sensing a father's approval while mending the porch he built decades prior. These experiences are accepted not as paranormal events, but as natural moments of connection. Within this cultural context, the Glen House haunting becomes less about proving the presence of a ghost and more about understanding what the house evokes in those who enter. The Christmas season, charged with memory and ritual, deepens these sensations. Visitors enter the Glen House already in a reflective state, perhaps thinking of past holidays, absent family members, old joys and wounds. The house meets them in that emotional space, offering its own silent reflections. The line between what the house remembers and what the visitor brings becomes beautifully blurred. Still, there remains one lingering question. Why the annual nature of the Glen House haunting? Why do the unusual occurrences cluster so consistently around December? Historians propose that the Glen family experienced significant events during Christmas seasons: illness, financial tension, or the loss of a child. If so, the emotional residue of those winters may have become embedded in the home's atmosphere, surfacing during the season that triggered them originally. This theory aligns with numerous cases in folklore where hauntings follow cyclical patterns tied to specific dates, anniversaries, seasonal rituals, or moments of trauma. Paranormal researchers offer their own thoughts. Some suggest that cold air, which intensifies in winter, strengthens conditions for auditory illusions, amplified drafts, or the movement of aged materials. Others hypothesize that electrical conductivity shifts in winter may affect sensory equipment and human perception. In these explanations, Christmas is not special. Winter is simply conducive to unusual sensations. And yet the community of Cape Girardeau does not frame the Glen House haunting as a winter phenomenon. They frame it specifically as a Christmas haunting. The timing is too precise, the emotional texture too specific. It is not the cold that awakens the house. It is the season itself, the rituals, the gatherings, the memories that rise like breath against frosted glass. Tonight, as we drift toward the heart of this seasonal mystery, the house grows quieter still. The staircase stands in soft shadow. The parlor tree glows faintly in imagined recollection, and the long December night presses gently against the windows. Within that gentle pressure, the Glen House seems to whisper its own answer. Not in words, but in atmosphere. Christmas is not merely a date, it is an echo, a time when memory grows louder than logic. And at the center of that echo stands the house itself, waiting on a cold night, as though holding a story it is not yet ready to release. The cold night settles over the Glen House with a weight that feels almost deliberate, as if winter itself has chosen this moment to press its quiet hand against the old clapboard walls. Down below, the river moves in slow, silvered waves, its breath rising in a low mist that merges with the darkness along the bluff. From the street, the Glen House stands silhouetted against that mist, regal and restrained, its white trim catching what little moonlight filters through the clouds. The Christmas lights from neighboring homes flicker faintly in the distance, but here, on this stretch of South Middle Street, there is only stillness, a stillness that seems to deepen the moment one looks toward the upper windows. It is in this winter silence, with the house resting beneath the full weight of its seasonal memory, that the story of how the Glen House lives in the collective heart of Cape Girardeau begins to take shape. To understand how this old Victorian home became so deeply intertwined with community memory, one must first consider the nature of the Ozarks community itself, its attachment to tradition, its reverence for the past, and its long-standing belief that the places we build become repositories for the lives we live. In towns like Cape Girardeau, history is not confined to textbooks or museum plaques. It is spoken aloud at dinner tables, passed between generations, and folded gently into the stories people tell when the nights grow long. The Glen House, preserved through the efforts of volunteers and local historians, became one of those vessels for communal remembrance, a place where visitors felt the weight of their own family histories reflected back at them in the polished floors and restored furnishings. When the house reopened to the public after its restoration, it quickly became more than an architectural landmark. School children filed through it on field trips, touching the carved newel post with hesitant fingers. Couples visited it during holiday tours, drawn to the soft glow of its Christmas decorations. Families returned each December to walk through rooms that reminded them of grandparents' homes, of heirloom ornaments, of holiday gatherings now confined to memory. The Glen House became a touchstone, not only for its ties to the past, but for the way it seemed to echo the emotions of those who stepped inside. It was during these community visits that the house's quiet mystique deepened. Elderly residents, some who had lived in Cape Girardeau for most of their lives, spoke of the house with a kind of affectionate solemnity. They remembered stories told by their parents or grandparents, stories of the house glowing faintly on winter nights when it was unoccupied, or of children hurrying past it on the way home from Christmas Eve services because they felt watched from the attic window. These recollections were shared not as frightening tales, but as pieces of local lore, carried forward with a sense of wonder and respect. Over time, certain details took root in the communal imagination. The scent of perfume, described independently by visitors who had never met, the rustle of skirts near the staircase, the faint, almost imperceptible footsteps heard by children who knew nothing of the house's history. These patterns created a shared narrative, one that belonged as much to Cape Girardeau as to the Glen family. People found comfort in the idea that the house might hold a presence not of fear, but of continuity, a reminder that lives, once lived within these walls, did not entirely vanish when the doors were shut. One of the most compelling elements of the Glen House's place in community memory is the way older residents describe their relationship to the house. Some refuse to enter during December, saying the house feels too alive that time of year. Others insist their family members once heard voices drifting from the upstairs hallway during winter nights, long before restoration began. A handful recall seeing a shadow in the parlor window while walking home from Christmas gatherings decades ago, a slender shape, feminine in outline, standing perfectly still before fading into darkness. These stories, though subjective, share a sense of emotional truth. People speak not with fear, but with a quiet awe that reflects their understanding of how places can carry the essence of those who once tended them. In Cape Girardeau, where the river shapes both livelihood and imagination, people know how the past can move through the present with the persistence of water along stone. The holiday tours strengthened this connection. Visitors came year after year, some bringing children who returned later as adults, drawn by the house's restrained elegance and its strange, calming melancholy. Many said the Glen House did not feel haunted in the typical sense. Instead, it felt inhabited by memory, by warmth, by a lingering emotion that softened the harsh edges of winter. During these tours, docents told the history of the Glen family, its hopes, its hardships, its place in the town's early growth. And always at the edges of these stories came the gentle mentions of the unexplained moments that continued to occur, moments visitors might or might not encounter during their walk through the house. But the Glen House's influence reached beyond those who visited in person. Writers, photographers, and local filmmakers found themselves drawn to its quiet charm and its layered history. Articles in regional newspapers speculated lightly about the Christmas ghost, never sensationalizing the idea, but acknowledging its enduring place in local lore. College students wrote essays about the house's design and its rumored presence. A few residents suggested that the Glen House embodied the emotional heart of Cape Girardeau, a reminder of its Victorian past, its Rivertown heritage, and the tender connection between memory and place. The most moving accounts, however, come from those who felt something deeply personal inside the house. One woman, visiting from Arkansas, paused in the upper hallway and felt an overwhelming sense of longing, a feeling she later described as someone missing somebody. A man from Illinois claimed he entered the parlor and suddenly remembered his grandmother's home, which had long since been torn down. It felt like stepping into the past, he said, but not my past, the past of somebody who lived a life I can almost understand. These experiences suggest something profound, that the Glen House not only stores its own memories, but amplifies the memories of those who visit, creating a shared emotional space where past and present intermingle. This blending of personal memory and community tradition creates a powerful effect. Even visitors who do not believe in ghosts often leave the Glen House feeling changed, quieter, more reflective, more aware of how sorrow and joy linger in the places we inhabit. The house seems to invite introspection, offering a glimpse into how time folds upon itself in old rooms. And yet, for all its warmth and nostalgia, there remains that persistent whisper, the feeling of being watched upon the staircase. Many visitors describe the sensation as gentle, as though someone is observing with curiosity rather than menace. But the feeling is unmistakable. People pause mid-step, look over their shoulder, and find only an empty hallway. For some, the sensation fades immediately. For others, it lingers like a faint chill beneath the skin. Tonight, as we pause at the foot of the staircase, that quiet sensation unfurls again. A soft prickle of awareness, a feeling that eyes from another time follow our movement, not threatening, not cold, simply present, as though the house itself is guiding us to the next piece of its story. And so, with the winter night pressed close outside and the house wrapped in the quiet breath of memory, we ascend toward that watchful presence, ready to step into the layer of mystery that has held Cape Girardeau's imagination for more than a century. The sensation of being watched on the staircase grows stronger the higher one climbs, not oppressive but perceptible, as though someone stands just beyond the edge of sight, observing with a quiet patience. It is a feeling countless visitors have described, though few speak of it loudly. The Glen House does not invite theatrics. It invites reflection. And so those who sense that watchful presence often pause halfway up the steps, resting their hand on the polished banister, listening to the house breathe around them. The air at this landing feels denser somehow, thicker with memory, as though this small stretch of hallway holds more than its share of the past. It is here, at this midpoint between the parlor below and the sleeping rooms above, that the Glen House feels most alive. Alive not with movement, but with expectation, with eyes, with echoes. Visitors who have felt this moment often describe the same thing, a stillness settling over them, a hush deeper than silence, a sense that a story waits ahead and another trails behind. This is the threshold where fact and folklore merge with an ease that makes it difficult to tell one from the other. And it is from this threshold that the final weave of the Glen House narrative begins to form, not as a tidy conclusion, but as a tapestry of unanswered threads, gentle hauntings, and the emotional residue that lingers in the spaces where families once lived, loved, and grieved. To understand these echoes, we must return briefly to the social world that shaped the Glen family. Victorian homes like this one were built around ritual, daily, seasonal, generational. The staircase itself served as the spine of the household, the route by which the family moved from public spaces to private ones. Children hurried down it on Christmas mornings, their feet pattering with excitement. Women ascended it late at night carrying folded linens or tending to sick loved ones. Men descended it in the early hours to meet business obligations across town. Over decades, the staircase held the rhythm of life, absorbing the footfalls of those who walked its length day after day. If an imprint were ever to form in a house, whether through emotional memory, residual energy, or the simple pattern of repeated movement, it would most likely appear in a place like this. Not in the attic, not in the cellar, but on the stairs. On the steps where the family's joys and sorrows passed in equal measure. On the steps where footsteps of worry and footsteps of celebration echoed differently. On the steps where someone might have paced quietly on a winter night, heavy with a grief too deep to speak. It is in these lingering impressions that the Glen House takes its place among the enduring legends of the Ozarks. Haunted houses in this part of the country rarely roar with terror. They whisper, they breathe, they echo with the memory of familiar lives, not sensational tragedies. Oral storytellers across the region often mention houses that listen, houses that watch, houses that remember the people who tended them. And in each of these stories, the haunting is described not as an intrusion from the dead, but as an echo from the living, an echo left behind by those who cared too deeply, suffered too quietly, or loved too fiercely to disappear without leaving a trace. The Glen House fits this pattern effortlessly. No violent event marks its history. No scandal shadows its family. Instead, the weight of its haunting lies in the depth of unspoken sorrow and the repetition of family rituals, especially those tied to the Christmas season. And so those who feel watched on the staircase are not frightened. They are moved. They recognize the sensation as one of gentle observation, as if someone from another century stands at the landing, seeing them not as intruders, but as guests, crossing a space that once mattered deeply. One volunteer described the feeling as like walking through someone's diary without their permission. Another said it felt like someone wanting to be remembered. A visitor from Tennessee claimed that as she stepped onto the landing one December afternoon, she felt a sudden warmth on her shoulder. Not a physical touch, but a soft pressure that made her stop and turn. No one stood behind her. When she reached the parlor later, she found her eyes inexplicably wet, as though the house had stirred something tender inside her. These experiences do not prove a haunting. They do not provide evidence of a ghost, but they speak to the power of places to hold emotion and to the power of people to feel it. They remind us that history is not always buried in documents and dates. Sometimes it floats in the air like a faint perfume. Sometimes it creaks in an old hallway. Sometimes it lingers on a staircase in December, watching, waiting. And yet, for all these moments, the Glen House remains a place of profound ambiguity. It never reveals itself fully. It never offers a clear message. Its presence, whether real or imagined, remains gentle, hesitant, unresolved. A whisper without a voice, a movement without a source, a memory without a name, though many choose to call her Lulu. Perhaps the most telling accounts come from longtime Cape Girardeau residents who refuse to go upstairs during December tours. They do not claim fear, they claim reverence. "I'd rather not disturb her," one elderly woman said softly. "If she's up there thinking her thoughts, I'll stay down here." Such statements may be rooted in folklore rather than fact, but they speak to the emotional honesty with which the community holds the legend. The Glen House is not haunted in a way meant to frighten. It is haunted in a way meant to acknowledge the people who walked its halls before us and the threads of their lives that refuse to unravel completely. Some visitors report hearing a faint sigh while standing on the landing. Others claim the air grows heavy, as if filled with unspoken words. A few have glimpsed a shadow in the corner of their eye, soft, pale, drifting toward the hallway before dissolving into nothing. These impressions offer no resolution. They offer only more questions. Does the Glen House truly hold a presence, or does it reflect the presence we carry within ourselves? Does it echo the footsteps of a woman who tended her home with devotion, or does it simply replay the emotional imprint of decades of winter nights? Do we sense sorrow in its halls because sorrow once lived here, or because winter itself stirs our own? The house does not answer. It never has. And so we leave the staircase behind, stepping once more into the parlor below, where the quiet deepens and the shadows lengthen across the hardwood floor. The house settles softly, as though folding its memories into the creases of the night. Ahead lies only one more layer of its story, one final deep breath of winter, where the past shifts gently towards silence, and the lingering presence of the Glen house moves from legend into something more like understanding. The hallway above remains quiet, waiting. The hallway above remains quiet, waiting, as though holding its breath in the long pause between memory and forgetting. Downstairs, the parlor settles into its own gentle stillness, lamplight softening along the edges of restored furniture, shadows lengthening across rugs woven in patterns older than anyone now living. Outside, the December night presses its cold face against the windows, blurring the view of the river below. The wind funnels up from the Mississippi in slow, weary gusts, wrapping the house in a hush that feels nearer to contemplation than silence. It is here, standing in the dim glow of a home that has carried so many stories across so many winters, that we step into the final reflection the Glen house offers, its lingering uncertainty, its quiet endurance, and the delicate boundary between history and the unseen. In this last space of the narrative, we are not searching for proof. The Glen house has never demanded that of its visitors. Instead, it invites a softer kind of listening, the kind that honors the ambiguity woven through every century-old story. For this home, perched above the river with its white trim and gentle curves, has always been defined less by what can be verified and more by what people feel when they stand inside its rooms. And feelings, however fleeting, are often where truth and legend meet most honestly. As we linger in the parlor, the house seems to wear its history in layers. The first layer is factual, rooted in the lives of Edwin and Lulu Glen, their children, their gatherings, their private sorrows. This is the layer documented in census records, tax notices, old newspaper clippings. A family lived here, struggled here, hoped here. The second layer is communal memory, the stories passed down by neighbors, whispered by children, recalled by elders who witnessed the house during its years of vacancy. These accounts add color to the history: the faint glow in the attic, the soft sob drifting on winter nights, the feeling of being observed on the staircase. The third and final layer is the emotional imprint sensed by those who walk through the house today. Volunteers, tourists, researchers, skeptics. It is this last layer, fragile and unprovable, that defines the haunting of the Glen house more than any apparition could. For many who visit, the house feels alive not in a dramatic sense, but in a contemplative one. It resembles a person deep in thought, holding memories close, bringing them forth only when the season draws them out. Winter, especially Christmas, seems to loosen the past from its moorings. During December, the rooms feel more attentive. The air feels more charged. Visitors move through the space slowly, lowering their voices without being told. They sense that something here remembers them, or perhaps remembers itself. If one stands very still in the parlor, listening closely, there is a sensation that the house is aware of being observed, not in a spectral way, but in the way old photographs sometimes seem to follow the eye. The Glen house sits in the present, restored by loving hands, open to the public, but it also sits in the past, still connected to the quiet tears, whispered prayers, and Christmas mornings that took place within its walls. That duality creates a strange, gentle resonance, one that many interpret as haunting. Perhaps the lingering presence is Lulu, tending her home with the same attentive grace she once offered in life. Perhaps it is an echo of Edwin pacing through the parlor on winter nights, calculating finances and worrying over bills. Perhaps it is the sorrow of a lost child, felt but not recorded. Or perhaps it is none of these, and the Glen house simply holds a mirror to the emotions visitors bring with them, reflecting longing, nostalgia, melancholy, and warmth in equal measure. In truth, it may not matter which interpretation is correct. The Ozarks have long embraced the idea that some houses hold on to the people who loved them, not as spirits trapped in limbo, but as impressions, faint as perfume, brief as a footstep, soft as the rustle of fabric on the stairs. These impressions do not frighten, they remind, they invite. They soften the space between the living and the dead until the two seem to touch, just for a heartbeat, in the quiet of a winter room. The Glen House exemplifies this tradition. Its haunting is not a threat, it is a memory gently clearing its throat. It is a sorrow settling into a chair at the edge of the room. It is a presence that does not seek to be solved, but simply wishes to be felt. To walk through the Glen House is to walk through echoes, some soft, some sharp, all of them carrying traces of the people who once filled its rooms with laughter, worry, and hope. And so we arrive at the final reflection, standing amid the dim glow of the parlor as the river continues its slow whisper outside. The Glen House haunting, if one chooses to call it that, is perhaps nothing more and nothing less than the convergence of human experiences layered over time. It is the weight of winter grief. It is the tenderness of Christmas ritual. It is the ache of memory pressed into walls by the people who lived here, and the sensitivity of those who visit, open to what the house quietly offers. Some say that when a home witnesses love and sorrow in equal measure, it becomes a vessel for both. Some say that winter deepens whatever a house contains. Some say that certain spirits stay not because they cannot leave, but because they are still listening to the life around them. And perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these ideas, soft, shifting, impossible to hold with certainty. As we prepare to leave the Glen House for the night, the parlor grows still once more. No footsteps sound from the upper hallway. No perfume drifts through the air. No light flickers in the attic window. The house stands quietly, dignified, wrapped in the hush of December. Outside, the wind brushes the eaves with the gentlest sigh, like the closing of a book whose final page refuses to explain everything. Maybe some stories are not meant to resolve. Maybe they are meant to linger, carried forward in the spaces between what we know and what we feel. The door closes softly behind us, and the Glen House fades into the winter night. Still, watchful, and full of something we may never find the words to name.